Hi, everybody. I'm Anthony Belov, and I know almost everybody in this room, which is wonderful. I am both a board member of ARCE-New York and an artist member here at Salmagundi, so I'm sort of the liaison between the two organizations, and I'm so happy that this is now our second year working together, collaborating on presentations here at the club, which is the oldest artist club in New York City, second oldest in the country. We were formed in 1871, and in 1917, Salmagundi bought what is now the oldest surviving mansion on Fifth Avenue, this building, which was built as a private residence in 1853. And to tell you about our guest speaker, John Fried has had a lifelong fascination with ancient Egypt and holds a degree in Middle Eastern Studies from the City University of New York. He is the author of several articles, which I have enjoyed immensely, published in Kemet, a modern journal of ancient Egypt, one of which was entitled Nubians, Assyrians, and Saites, which will touch upon what he's going to discuss tonight, the life and troubled times of Mayor Montuemhat. He is also the much esteemed and august, that doesn't say that here, president of the New York chapter of the American Research Center in Egypt, ARCE. And with that, I turn it over to John Fried. We will say so loud.
Yes. Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Anthony, for the introduction. I appreciate it. Alex, thank you very much for letting us use the facilities here again. I really do. I want to start with an interesting point, I think. There's an old Chinese curse that goes, "May you be condemned to live in interesting times." If ever someone lived in interesting times, it was Montuemhat. He lived in a country that was torn apart by civil disorder and by an invasion from the south, the Kushites, from what's now the Sudan, and then later an invasion by the Assyrians. So it was a period of trouble. He lived a life that you would think was kind of idyllic. He was very wealthy, very powerful, the mayor of Thebes, governor of Upper Egypt, and he was charged with cleaning up Karnak temple after the Assyrians looted it. And he was humiliated towards the end of his career by a pharaoh who came from the north and reunited Egypt. But we'll get to that. Okay. So, Montuemhat, as I said, he was the fourth prophet of Amun, the great god of Egypt. And it's a relatively low title in the temple. He had a grandfather who was a vizier. He was like the prime minister of Egypt. But he himself was only the fourth prophet of the god. So a fairly low title in the hierarchy in the priesthood. But he was the mayor of Thebes, as I said, was the governor of Upper Egypt, appointed that way by the Nubian pharaoh Taharka. And let's see, he was married to a princess. One of the Nubian daughters of one of the Nubian kings was his wife. And that got him in a lot of trouble later on in his life. So, right, he also built one of the largest, if not the largest, private tombs in the entire history of Egypt. Right? So here he is with his son, Nestor, and one of his three wives. This was his second wife, Shekhinmut. All right. Now, as I said, he built one of the largest tombs, non-royal tombs in all of Egyptian history. We're going to talk about it in a little more detail later. It hasn't been fully cleared, but many of the reliefs I'm going to show you tonight have been taken from the tomb, and they're now scattered in museums all over the world. Japan has a bunch. There are a fair number in the Brooklyn Museum. There's some in Europe. And since the tomb hasn't really been cleared and tourists can't go there, that's really the only place we can see art from his period, or from his life. All right. Now, as I mentioned, the Nubians ruled Egypt at this time in history. Traditionally, the Egyptians had gone south into what's now the Sudan, and they had ruled that area. But as the Egyptian government began falling apart in the 24th dynasty, the Nubians saw an opportunity to come north and conquer Egypt, and they took advantage of it. So Taharqa was the Nubian pharaoh at the time, through most of Montuemhat's life. And he came, as we said, came north, conquered Egypt, controlled it, and did a lot of building in Karnak. This is the largest temple complex in the world. It dwarfs the Vatican. All right, just to give you an idea, originally when this was built, this column here is Taharqa's, there were 10 of those. And just to give you an idea of scale, there's a couple of tourists down there. Okay, so you can see the scale is immense. Now, what's also an interesting bit of scale, as tall as this is, back there is taller. You just can't tell from the photograph that what's going on back here is much older and much larger and taller. So we're talking monumental architecture in Karnak Temple. All right. He also built a kiosk, kind of what we would call today the back of the temple, the eastern part of the temple. And it was partially destroyed by the Assyrians. It was mined for stonework by later kings who didn't particularly like the Nubian pharaohs and would like to have erased their memory from history. And that brings us to one problem Taharqa had. He liked to mess in the foreign affairs of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire centered in what's now Iraq. They were pushing south into the Levant, and Taharqa probably correctly saw the Assyrians as a serious threat. So he kept sending armies into what's now the Levant to attempt to block the Assyrians from coming south. It completely failed. He lost every battle with the Assyrians. And the Assyrian kings, of course, got just a little upset with the interference. So we have Sargon II, one of the most powerful of the Assyrian kings. You can see here the standard garments, the crown with the kind of the conical top. He's got this thing right here on his wrist. We don't know what it is. It's probably a piece of jewelry of some sort, but Assyriologists kind of derisively call it the royal wristwatch, because that's what it looks like. But obviously it's not a wristwatch. He's got the staff of authority, a sword, these heavy garments, and these very long beards that are elaborately curled. And then the long hair in the back that also has the elaborate curls in it. Very standard type of Assyrian art. All right, Sargon pushed into the Levant, defeated, the peoples of the Levant and the Egyptian armies. Sargon is mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, in the Bible. I believe so, and some of his successors are for sure. He dies in battle and was succeeded by Sennacherib, who was assassinated by his sons. And then the 5 sons had a nice long squabble, and eventually Esarhaddon becomes the new king of Assyria. Right. Esarhaddon, now for the first time, the Assyrians actually enter Egypt. They take Memphis. That's about as far south as they came. They conquer the traditional capital of Egypt. And as part of that, Taharqa, realizing he was going to lose, he fled south to Thebes, where the Karnak Temple is. But his family didn't get out. All right, so his wives and his heir, his son, were all captured by the Assyrians and taken north to Assyria. Now, if you look, this is a victory stela of Esarhaddon. It's now in the British Museum. And you can see here a few people way down at the bottom by the king's feet. And we're going to look at a little detail here. This person is kneeling. He's got a rope around his neck. And Esarhaddon is holding the top of the rope at the top of the stela. That's the son of Taharqa, kneeling before the Assyrian king. We don't know what happened to him after this. We have this scene showing that the Nubians had been thoroughly beaten. but we don't know what happened to this particular individual. And if I'm not talking much about Montuemhat, don't worry, he comes back into the picture shortly. All right. So Ashurbanipal becomes the next king after Esarhaddon. He's coming to Egypt to invade Egypt the second time. He dies en route. Was he assassinated? Well, given Assyrian politics, yeah, he could have been, but we don't know for sure. All right, they were very good at assassinating their kings. A man named Necho is in the city of Saite in the Nile Delta. He's appointed to be the northern Egyptian governor for the Assyrians. Right? And he conspired with the ARCE. After Ashurbanipal appoints him to be the governor for Assyria, he immediately shows his loyalty by conspiring to kick the Assyrians out. And he starts working with the ARCE, probably with the idea of splitting Egypt between the two of them. So Esarhaddon, as I said, brings his army south again, dies en route. He's succeeded by Ashurbanipal, who was one of Assyria's greatest kings. And you can see here, again, this elaborate long beard with the curls, the elaborate curls and the long hair. And the bracelets, very traditional portrayal of the Assyrian king. I mean, just you can't tell them apart unless you can read the inscriptions, because it's the same thing. All right. Now, Ashurbanipal kept a record of all of his conquests. And this is the Rassam cylinder that lists all of them. And we've got just a dozen columns of conquests listed out on this particular document. The cylinder tells us that Taharka, and I quote, forgot the power of Assyria. Against the kings and governors appointed by my father, he marched. It didn't work out very well for Taharka. There is a representation in Ashurbanipal's palace in what's now Iraq, and it shows the Assyrians laying siege to an Egyptian fortress. All right, the fortress is here. You can see ladders they're using to try and scale the walls to get into the fortress. And down in here you've got an Assyrian soldier digging into the side of the walls, trying to undermine the fortress walls. And another Assyrian is using a torch to try and destroy the walls. So they're coming at this from all directions. Now, the Assyrians love to show their enemies having very unpleasant deaths. So we've got here an Egyptian who's been shot by an arrow falling off the battlements to his death down on the ground. We've got another one over here meeting the same fate, and another one here. And so the Assyrians love this. There's some of their portraits of their enemies dying are grim, truly grim. Now right below that, well, here's a detail again. Here's the person with the torch trying to undermine the walls. Here are some archers. You see they've got a shield kind of thing that they can use to protect themselves as they fire. And there's the Egyptian again falling off the battlements. And then down below that, down here, there are some of the defenders are being led away. They're prisoners. We have here some Egyptians being led away. And here you can see these are clearly Nubian prisoners because they've got the distinctive feathered headdress of the Nubian warriors. And remember I said the Assyrians like to show a grim end to some of their enemies? Here's a warrior back here, an Assyrian, who has the severed head of a Nubian in his hand. He's holding it out like this. Right? So they were very fond of showing this kind of grim detail in their palace. Right? So at this point, Ashurbanipal, who of course, as every other Assyrian king, showed himself capable of defeating a lion single-handed, he invades, conquers, as I said, down to Memphis. And Taharka dies. Necho is appointed. Once again, I don't know why. He was disloyal once. But he's reappointed as the leader of northern Egypt for the Assyrians. Taharqa dies, he's succeeded by Tanuadaman, and Tanuadaman promptly comes north again, invades Egypt, and kills Necho. Now the Assyrians weren't going to let that stand. And as I said, Taharqa passes away. He was buried in his pyramid in Nuri, which is in what's now the Sudan. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has a lot of these Ushabtis in their basement. They excavated the pyramid. They found, I don't know how many of them. They're interesting objects. These are Egyptian objects that the Nubians brought into their culture. What they are is the inscription tells the Ushabti that if the deceased is called in the afterlife to do manual labor, corvée labor, the Ushabti will stand up and say, "Here I am, I'll do the work." All right, so the deceased can go on doing his nice, quiet, enjoyable life in the afterlife. Now, a very wealthy individual not only had a bunch of Ushabtis that did the work, he would also have Ushabtis that would manage the work of the other Ushabtis. So he had supervisor Ushabtis. And as I said, this is very traditional Egyptian, taken over by the Nubians, who did indeed adopt a tremendous amount of Egyptian culture over the couple thousand years that they were in contact with each other. Okay, now, as I said, Necho gets killed by Tanuadaman. Ashurbanipal's not going to let that stand. So he invades Egypt. And this is where Montuemhat comes back into the picture. All right. Ashurbanipal not only goes past Memphis, he keeps going south all the way to Thebes. And he loots the Karnak temple. He steals the sacred statue of the god Amun. He steals the treasure in the storerooms, the food, the clothing. He just loots the place. There may have been some burning, a complete mess. Well, Montuemhat's the mayor of Thebes, governor of Upper Egypt. Guess who gets to clean up the mess? Montuemhat. All right? So, Ashurbanipal, before he leaves, he elevates Necho's son to be the new leader of northern Egypt, the Nile Delta. We're going to hear more about this son very shortly. All right? It was a man named Samtik. All right. So, Montuemhat's got to clean up the mess. And it's not just Karnak. The temple of Mut was also terribly damaged. Mut is the consort, the wife of the god Amun. And the temple of Mut is near Karnak. Montuemhat tells us in an inscription that he rebuilt the temple of Mut. He did a new sacred boat because the Egyptians housed the cult statue of their gods in a long boat, because of course that's how you moved up and down Egypt. You traveled up and down the Nile River. He purified the temple after the invasion of unclean foreigners, his words. New cult statues were made, the temple of Mut was restored, and there is a scene here of, let me just make sure I get this right, Taharqa. Montuemhat, his son, his oldest son, and his Nubian wife worshiping all together, worshiping Mut together. And again, that would get him in trouble. So, now, there's plenty of artwork surviving of Montuemhat. He's one of the best represented Egyptian nobles in history. This particular piece is in the Cairo Museum today, and it's got a very odd headdress. I'm not sure what to do with it. First off, it would have originally been painted, so you probably would have been able to see a little bit more clearly what it was. But I think it's just a cloth covering to protect his head from the sun. I think that's what it is, but it's a guess on my part. Now, this period in time, there's a lot of what we call archaizing art. It's a look back to ancient Egyptian art, going back, in some cases, more than 1,000 years, and incorporating these things into the art of the time. And here we're in the Oh, we're somewhere, I think the Assyrians invaded in 671. So we're a long ways away from the earliest part of Egyptian history. All right. This particular statue over here is Montuemhat, and it looks very much like an 18th dynasty statue. And keep in mind, we're now in the 25th dynasty, so this is hundreds of years earlier. The long cloak, the inscription down the middle, giving the names and titles of the person. And this particular statue over here is an 18th dynasty statue, similar style. Again, the inscription down the middle, names and titles of the person that this statue represents. And notice the hand here, that hand here, fist closed, same here. All right, the headdresses are very similar. Now, this particular beard is not on this particular statue, but this is a very typical 18th dynasty type of beard for a nobleman to be wearing. So we're going back in time. And Montuemhat doesn't start this. This actually goes back a little bit before him. But he and his contemporaries are going to really use this in their art. Now this is a statue of Montuemhat. And if you look, this looks so 4th dynasty, except for the headdress. I mean, we're going back well over 1,000 years. He's striding forward, the left foot forward, the heavier legs, which is very typical of 4th dynasty art. This kilt is straight out of the 4th dynasty. If you come over here, this is a statue of Menkaura, who built the 3rd pyramid at Giza. 4th dynasty. Well over 1,000 years earlier. And you see it's the same exact kilt. This kilt wasn't used in the 26th dynasty. He's very consciously going back to the old artwork. The arms down on the side, he's got the little bolts of cloth that the nobles would use to wipe the sweat off their head. And you see that same thing in Menkaura's hand. All right, the headdress is typical 18th dynasty headdress. And Montuemhat, of course, couldn't use this headdress. That's reserved for royalty. So you got a statue here with 4th dynasty kilt, 4th dynasty, legs, and general feel to it, and an 18th dynasty headdress, and it was made in the 26th dynasty. So he just keeps going back and looking at this old art. And as I said, he's not the only nobleman at the time that did this. Some of his contemporaries, like Nespakashuti and a few others, did the same thing. Other statues of Montuemhat over on the right, these kneeling statues became very common in the 18th dynasty. Sometimes a stela, with an inscription, would be out in front of the individual. This particular one, this is a statue of ARCE-NY I put up here for comparison. ARCE-NY is an 18th dynasty figure. In fact, some people say he's the lover of Queen Hatshepsut. That was the rumor. Now, he doesn't have a stela. He's got a representation of Hathor. This is a knot of Isis, one of the goddesses. So this is more of a religious thing. But in the 18th dynasty, they did it this way. And they did it that way with a stela. So again, you got Montuemhat harking back to the old styles of art. Now here we've got Montuemhat as a Sem priest. All right, a Sem priest was responsible for many religious functions. The chief being, he presided at the funeral of a wealthy individual. All right, a Sem has a leopard skin. You can always spot the Sem priest. He's got a leopard skin. You can see the paws here and here. Here's the head of the leopard. The tail comes down this way. And what's interesting here is, yes, again, this is an 18th dynasty type of artwork in the tomb of Montuemhat. This gives us some idea of how Egyptian art was done in tombs. Originally, someone would come in and they would paint. You see the hieroglyphs up here in red ink. So they would paint the entire scene. Then a sculptor would come in and they would rough it out. And then a master sculptor came in and did the fine details. So it gives you just a little idea how the Egyptians did these elaborate reliefs in the various tombs. All right. Another thing that was typically included in any wealthy nobleman's tomb is their funeral procession, because this showed all of the grave goods they would need being brought to the tomb. So you've got these individuals who look suspiciously like 4th Dynasty, their headdresses. So we're going back in time again to the old art. They're bringing in cases of food, garments, staffs of authority, maybe chairs, anything the deceased would need in the afterlife. Right? And they're bringing, here's a mirror that's coming in. All right? So these gift bearers, again, they're harking back to the 4th Dynasty. This particular item may have been copied from the tomb of ARCE-NY, which is an 18th Dynasty tomb. It's a rather obscure thing. There's a ceremony in the funeral rites, the opening of the mouth, where the Sim priest is supposed to sleep, and he's awakened by other priests, and that represents the return to life of the deceased. Or it could be a very obscure thing called a tekenu. We don't know what the tekenu had to do in the funeral ritual. We have no idea. Some people say he's part of the opening of the mouth. Some people say he's not. I think this is representation of a tekenu, taken again, I think, out of the tomb of ARCE-NY, or copied. But I don't really know what the tekenu has to do with anything in the funeral rites. It's just not clear. All right? Now, once again, here's Montuemhat with his wife, one of his wives, and he's got this garment. It comes to here, and then it goes down to the ankles, and you've got these straps that hold it up. He's got the elaborate jeweled collar here, the headdress, very typical 18th Dynasty. His wife, again, represented with one arm around him, the other hand holding his other arm. Very standard 18th Dynasty art. But again, we're in the 25th Dynasty. He's sitting in front of an offering table, loaves of bread, geese, vegetables, anything the deceased might need in the afterlife to eat. And apparently they believe magically that if people stopped coming to the tomb to make offerings, that these inscriptions would magically feed the deceased in the afterlife. All right. This piece I love. Again, the 4th Dynasty headdress. And my first glance, I saw this. It's in the Brooklyn Museum. It was 4th Dynasty, imitation. But then I looked at this. This is like nothing I've ever seen in Egyptian art before. It shows the scribe with his legs crossed, tucked underneath him, and his kilt would have been spread over so he could write on a papyrus scroll. And there is a 4th Dynasty sculpture that is very famous. It's now in the Louvre Museum, and it shows exactly what we're looking at. Here, this scribe has his kilt, and he's got, if you can see in his hand, he's unrolling a scroll so he can write on it as a wealthy man dictates whatever it is needs to be written down. So, and you can see again this close-cropped hair or headdress. Again, very 4th Dynasty, except this is just totally unique. All right. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, he copied some stuff out of the tomb of ARCE-NY. ARCE-NY wasn't the only tomb he got ideas from. This piece, again, is in the Brooklyn Museum. It shows a woman picking fruit off a tree. She's got a child, and this child is nursing as she's picking fruit, and she's got cloth wrapped around her and the child so that she can pick the fruit while the child is nursing. You can see the child's feet here. The chair is very unusual. It's got a lotus at the bottom, a lotus plant, rather than the traditional lion's paw or something like that. Right? And when I say that he took things out of other people's tombs to inspire what went into his tomb, we know exactly where he got this idea. The tomb of Mena from the 18th Dynasty has a delightful painting showing someone working in Mena's fields, in his farmland, doing the exact same thing. She's picking fruit, putting it in the basket, she's nursing a child as she does that. And we can be even more sure this is a copy because Montuemhat's artist shows the woman's legs being crossed at the ankle. Very unusual pose for an Egyptian woman. And in Mena's tomb, it's the exact same pose. Now, I don't have a picture of it, unfortunately, but in Montuemhat's tomb, there's also a representation of two young girls fighting, pulling each other's hair, and that also comes from the tomb of Mena. There's a painting exactly like it in Mena's tomb. So they were going back and looking at all these old tombs and using the artwork. All right, here's another representation up here. Look at the headdresses, very typical 18th dynasty. All right, but this is Montuemhat, again in the 25th dynasty. Down here, same headdresses, you've got people rowing boats. This is from the nearby temple of Hatshepsut, all right, at Dil Bahri. So you've got the same, same type of figures in the boating scenes. So again, they keep going back and getting this old art and bringing it forward. Now, as I mentioned, Montuemhat had one of the largest, if not the largest tomb ever made for a nobleman, non-royalty. All right. What's interesting too is after the 20th dynasty ended, the Egyptian noblemen at Thebes stopped making big tombs. Stopped. They didn't do it anymore. What they did was they started reusing old tombs and made family vaults out of them. So, person dies, you take the coffin, put it in the vault, sealed up. Next person in the family passes away, you take it, put it in the vault, sealed up. So they didn't do these big elaborate tombs. But when we get to the 25th dynasty, they start doing it again. And this is insane. I've never seen anything like this until I ran into this. They did these big pylons, almost an imitation of a temple pylon. Mud brick, not stone. Right? And you would enter the tomb complex through here. And you can see it's immense. Here's where those pylons are, right down here. There's a descending passageway into the antechamber. And then there are two open courtyards you can look down into from the ground level. We'll see some pictures in a second. And then all of this back here. Just elaborate complex of passages, staircases, rooms. Again, the tomb has not been completely excavated, so we don't know what all of this was, but it's incredibly elaborate. And these chambers right here, there are 6 of them off of this main courtyard. They were the burial places, the burial chambers for his family. Although, we don't know which family members were buried there. So, there's the pylons. You go down in, here's the descending passageway that leads to the antechamber. And all this is right near the temple of Hatshepsut, the Dil Bahri. It's actually not a very long walk to get over there. This is the first courtyard where you look down into it from ground level. And there's a couple interesting things going here. First of all, you're coming in from down here. The antechamber is here. And you're coming into this room from right here. You're looking up at what looked like the steps in a temple. Because the way an Egyptian temple worked is you would keep going up the further back you went in the temple. And the roof kept getting lower as you went back in the temple until you got to the Holy of Holies, where it was actually a pretty small room. All right, just enough room for the boat with the cult statue of the god in it. All right, so he's got this kind of an imitation of a temple. And what's very interesting here is on the sides, these are papyrus. Right, there's the stem, you can see the papyrus flowers, and they're tied together. This is a very common type of decoration on contemporary coffins, the Quaru coffins. And there's just some thought that he was consciously imitating the coffin in this particular, open courtyard. He's not the only person to do this type of decoration. There's another one, I've forgotten his name, but he's contemporary of Montuemhat's, did the same thing. Now, if you turn around and look back, Here's where you come in from the antechamber. Again, you can see those papyrus, bundles tied together. On each side, there's a representation of Montuemhat and his Nubian wife, Wageneris. Again, very typical. He's there, she's got her arm around him. This was all going to be problems for him. He's got one last major issue, not just cleaning up the Assyrian destruction. He's got one more humiliation coming. All right, so there it is. There's a little bit better view of it. It's Montuemhat with his wife. There's the papyrus that might come from the coffin decoration. All right, we don't know where his wives were buried, by the way. We think his Nubian wife might have been buried here. We don't know where the other two were buried. We believe his son Nestor was buried here, but we don't know where his other two sons were buried. So, and again, hopefully, when they finish excavating the tomb, they'll have answers to that question. Now, I mentioned earlier the son of Necho, a man named Psamtik. I said we'd hear more about him. Well, here's where we hear more about him. He gets Greek mercenaries and starts to move south from the Nile Delta, conquering Egypt as he goes. He's Egyptian, right? The art here is, again, very standard archaizing art. The royal headdress, the beard. It reminds me very much of a statue of the Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose III that's now in the Luxor Museum. It's just, stylistically, it's just very, very similar. So, it's not just Montuemhat and the other nobles using this archaizing art. The kings do it too. Now, he's the son of Necho, and you remember Necho got killed by the Nubians coming north again, trying to reconquer Egypt. Psamtik flees to Assyria and asks the Assyrian king to help him get his throne back in northern Egypt. Well, Ashurbanipal decides that's a good thing to do. And he comes north, and again, he loots the Karnak temple, and he restores Psamtik to his throne. All right, as soon as the Assyrians leave, he begins plotting to take over the entirety of Egypt for himself. As I said, he got Greek mercenaries, and we're not that far away now. The Greeks are playing a role in Egyptian history. And it's only going to be about 300 years, 340 years. We're going to have Alexander the Great conquering Egypt. But the Greek, this was all laid out in advance. The Greeks became a very important part of what's going on in Egyptian history at this time. And of course, after Alexander dies, one of his generals, Ptolemy, becomes the king of Egypt. And the last of his successors is a Greek princess named Cleopatra. You may have heard something about her. So Psamtik comes south, uses Greek mercenaries, and he conquers southern Egypt. Montuemhat, realizing, it's time to accept the reality of Egypt being reunited under Psamtik. He goes along with it. Now, Psamtik did something very intelligent, I think. There's a very powerful priestess in the temple of Karnak, the god's wife of one. They had an estate that was extremely wealthy. They were very powerful. The people in southern Egypt were very adoring of the woman in this role. When Psamtik came south, the woman in this role was the daughter of one of the Nubian kings. He didn't really want that, but he also knew if he deposed her, it could be a very serious problem for him. It just wouldn't look good and it wouldn't go over well. So what he did was, he took Shep-en-Wepet II, who was the current god's wife of one, and said, okay, you're going to adopt my daughter, Nitocris, as your successor. And that kind of went over. It was a smart move on his part because he didn't stir up any major ill will doing this. So, Nitocris becomes Shep-en-Wepet's successor, and she has this huge household, lots of power. But here's where Montuemhat's last humiliation comes in. Once, there's a famous statue, the Adoption Stela, that tells the story of Shep-en-Wepet II adopting Psamtik's daughter, Nitocris. All right, this is a representation of Nitocris. This is not the stela in question. This is on a wall in the Temple of Karnak. All right, so Montuemhat had this reputation of being loyal to the Nubian kings. He never rebelled, and he was just, throughout the entirety of his life, he stayed faithful to the Nubians. So Psamtik decided to pay back Sabert. He's going to make him pay back, and he does. All right. The adoption stela gives a list of what Montuemhat and his family have to contribute to Nitocris's, her household. For Montuemhat, 200 devon of bread daily, 5 hin of wine daily, 1 cake daily, 1 bundle of vegetables every day, 3 oxen once a month. Now 3 oxen, that's a big deal. That's 36 oxen in a year. That is a major expense. All right? And then 5 geese every month. So was Psamtik done with Montuemhat? Nah, not yet. His son, Nesta, was also required to contribute. 100 devon of bread every day, 2 hin of wine daily, 15 cakes monthly, 10 jars of beer monthly. He's still not done. Wagerenis, you remember, she's the Nubian princess that Montuemhat married. She was singled out in the stela. She had to contribute 100 devon of bread daily. And this is no doubt, payback because she's a Nubian princess. I have no doubt in my mind this is exactly what's going on here. So, now this is obviously not Wageneris. This is an 18th dynasty representation of a princess with a couple of loaves of bread. All right. So we now have Egypt reunited. Montuemhat is an elderly man at this point. He passes away in a few more years. All right. And just to kind of harken back to where we started, Montuemhat in the middle, the Archaeas, the art. He's a major figure in Egyptian history, one of the best known, most important noblemen in Egyptian history. But he was caught in the middle between the Nubians and the Assyrians. And at the end of his life, he was humiliated by Psamtik, who reunited Egypt and founded the 26th dynasty. As I said, Montuemhat passes away a few years later, and we pass into a new era of Egyptian history. So, if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to find out.
John?
Yes, sir.
There may not be any answer to this, but I'm fascinated by Montuemhat's pylon because of that great arch that is so not Egyptian.
Yes.
Do you know what's been written, or?
No idea.
And do you think it's original to the pylon?
Yes.
That's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know why. The only thing that's really been published on the tomb in any detail is Edna Russman did a couple of articles in the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt. She doesn't talk about the pylons. She talks about the substructure. So I really don't know. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the fact of archaizing art, but what was the reason for it? Is there any motivation? Like, do we know what they were hearkening back to that may have been valuable in the present, or was it just a failure of contemporary imagination?
It's speculation, what I'm about to say, but I'm not the only one speculating. We think this is an attempt to go back and show yourself with all these powerful people from ancient history. All right. He's showing himself as Menka, or like Menka-Ra, the builder of one of the Great Pyramids. He's taking art from the tomb of Rekhmire, who was the prime minister of Egypt at the top of the Egyptian Empire. He was the prime minister under Thutmose III, who is frequently referred to as Napoleon of Egypt. So we think this is an attempt to take and say, oh, our country's not so good today, but we're going back to what we were. I think that's what it is.
Good old days.
Yeah, the good old days, exactly.
Okay, the Egypt queen.
Go ahead.
what you said implies to me, probably correctly, that at least a goodly number of these tombs were accessible.
Yes, they were.
So, if I understand correctly, some of the tombs could be entered to a certain degree in order to leave offerings and that sort of thing, and then
Yes.
there were sections that were closed off. That's correct?
The typical 18th dynasty tomb is you have an entranceway, and then you have a traverse hall going, this way, and then a passageway into the back of the tomb. At the end of the tomb, there might be a false door or some sort of altar to do offerings in. The burial was down below. They would dig a tunnel in, and the burial would take place underground, and it would be covered over and sealed up. So you could still go in, you could see all these beautiful pictures painted on the walls or carved, and they were open. You could just walk in, maybe make an offering to the deceased. But yeah, you could definitely see them.
But not the pharaohs' tombs, not
No.
the royal tombs. Yeah.
No, not the royal tombs. Well, at this point in history, the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings have probably already been looted.
Yeah. And is there ongoing excavation now? Or?
There's been off and on clearance, and I don't know where it stands now. The last thing I saw again was one of Edna Russman's articles, and that's going back 10, 11 years. But at the time she wrote it, there was work being done. Yeah, Bob.
Hey, John, great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were showing the tombs that he borrowed from. Rekmare, I can see, he was the vizier of Egypt. That's a big guy, and you can borrow from that. Does it strike you as strange that he's borrowing from Mena, who was a poor man, relatively poor?
Relative, compared certainly to Rekmare.
Worker.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know that I've thought about it. Maybe you saw the picture and said, that's nice, I want that. It's a nice touch, because this kind of thing would have been going on in the lands that he owned. And you say, good touch, I like that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, Mena was certainly no comparison, no comparison to Montuemhat, much less Rekmare.
Anyone else?
One other thing, John?
Yeah.
That great painting you showed us of the scribe, which you said is really strange, which it is, really strange. What's strange about it, I guess, is the perspective, right?
Yeah.
It's just that it's shown frontally, whereas when you showed the statue, you could see what it is.
Yeah.
But they just didn't do that. I mean,
And if you look closely, it's kind of odd, because the body is shown frontal, the legs are crossed, frontal, but the head is this way.
Yeah.
And that's actually, that kind of thing does happen in Egyptian art. That's not unique to Montuemhat. But showing it kind of in real perspective with the legs crossed in front, I've never seen anything like that.
no, it's great. I've never seen it.
Yeah. Yes.
Just to say there's a parallel, an exact parallel.
Okay, great.
Neok-Khnum and Khnumhotep.
Could you say that louder, Ann?
Neok-Khnum and Khnumhotep, the tomb that's the twins or the two gay lovers or whatever.
goodness, really?
At Saqqara.
It's in Saqqara,
but
yeah.
they can't have copied it from that because that was underneath the Unis Causeway by then.
Yeah.
It
I don't know
must
what
have been
caused them
more
to do
common
that,
than
but
the
that's
people.
nice. I didn't know that. Thank you very much.
I only know it because I had a student show me in a presentation last week. So.
Perfect timing. Wonderful. So I'll have to go and try and find a picture of that, because it's just such an odd thing.
Well, unless there are more questions, I think we all want to thank John for this.
Thank you.